G.W. Leibniz, the late 17th century German philosopher, is in many ways one of the most interesting, intriguing, and at the same time elusive thinkers of that transitional period between what's known as the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment. There's a particular allure to Leibniz on various levels. He lived an extremely interesting life. He was the son of a professor, an incredibly precocious student as a lad, studied Greek and scholastic philosophy. He claimed at 14 he read soirées as other youths would read romance novels. And I think he meant not only in terms of affinity, the ease with which he understood it, but with that sort of avidity, with the joy and pleasure he took in it. He was involved in various, sometimes not particularly fruitful, but interesting projects during his life. He at one point tried to reconcile the Catholic and Protestant creeds. That didn't succeed very well. He then tried to reconcile the Calvinist and Lutheran creeds. Again, not much luck there. And then finally, he did attempt to create a sort of League of Nations for Christian Europe, and tried to get the Tsar of Russia involved in that project. Again, very little came of it. He worked in the service of the House of Hanover, which, as you know, will eventually became the royal family of England, as it is till this day. He spent time in Paris, where he met various important high cultural figures, Malebranche, Arnauld, Boyle, the famous English scientist, Oldenburg, the head of the Royal Academy of Sciences. Read widely in Descartes and modern philosophy. Spent some time in Amsterdam with Baruch Spinoza. In fact, he read at least a good chunk of the Ethics in manuscript form and carried on a correspondence with him. Obviously read Descartes, read Locke, seems to have corresponded with Sir Isaac Newton. He did work in mechanics, in optics, in dynamics, in a range of fields, and most famously, of course, he worked on and independently arrived at an infinitesimal calculus. In fact, he developed it independently slightly after Newton, but he published before Newton did, which led to some dispute as to who had, in fact, been the original author, a rather fruitless dispute. Basically, they both developed it independently. More than that, he's also fascinating for the absolutely, and I choose this word advisedly, fabulous doctrines that he expressed and held and maintained. Fabulous in two senses, in the sense in which they are inspiring, they are elaborate, they are ornate, so fabulous in an honorific sense, and then fabulous in a much more sort of vernacular sense, in that there's a level at which they're almost bizarre, strange. There is a certain point at which one wants to sort of intuitively say, you've got to be kidding me. You can't really believe this. But they are fascinating doctrines, the range of which, and ultimate conclusions of which, have been immortalized in fiction. For any of you who've read Voltaire's Candide and remember the character of Dr. Pangloss, Dr. Pangloss is Leibniz. And his doctrine, which is that this is, in fact, the best of all possible worlds, was, in fact, one of Leibniz's central teachings. That may sound like a fabulous doctrine, but it's absolutely tame compared to his others. He believed that the universe was made up of something called monads. Each monad is a mirror of the entire universe. If one could see into each monad, one could know everything about every other monad, everywhere, all at once, for all time, past, present, future. Nonetheless, each monad is completely autonomous and stands in no relation to any other monad. There are, of course, an innumerable number of monads. Everything in the universe, which is made of monads, works in accordance with a pre-established harmony, and history moves towards a moral kingdom, or a kingdom of God, within the realm of nature. Everything has a soul, and everything inclines for the best, and hence we can see that this is, in fact, the best of all possible worlds. Well, I'm going to return to those doctrines, but I want to also say a few more things about why he intrigues us. He intrigues us because in many ways he's a precursor to important subsequent developments in the history of philosophy. His views on history as being the emergence of a moral world within the natural world, of history being progressive, prefigure the sort of thinking we find in Vico, in Kant, in Herder, in Hegel, in Marx, and other substantive thinkers on history in the late 18th and especially the 19th century. As we'll see, his views about the relativity of space and time not only prefigure developments in 20th century physics, but his view that they're mentally constructed prefigures the Kantian distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal. And finally, his critique of extension, and with it an implied critique of the notion of matter, and his role of God as a sort of universal switchboard between monads, certainly prefigures and presupposes the development of classic idealism, both in Berkeley in the English tradition and in classic German idealism of the late 18th and early 19th century. So this is why we're intrigued by Leibniz, why we want to get at Leibniz. On the other hand, there is the problem at getting at him. He's an eminently logical thinker. In fact, one of Leibniz's projects was the development of a universally rational language in which you could resolve all disputes simply through a sort of calculus. And what he has in mind clearly is a truth functional calculus. He has in mind symbolic logic, the sort of logic that powers your computer in a sense. Had he developed that, he would have given us that tool a good century and a half to 2 centuries before we developed it. So he's an eminently logical thinker. At the same time, he never synthesized his work into a systematic treatise. His published works are extremely brief and are sometimes inconsistent. And that always leaves a challenge how to pull them together. What makes that challenge all the more problematic is the fact that there exists a greater inconsistency between his published works and his unpublished manuscripts. This has led one of his principal interpreters, Bertrand Russell, to conclude that Leibniz in fact had two philosophies. That, to paraphrase Russell, Leibniz was a great thinker but a very bad person in the sense that he lacked the courage of his convictions. He professed a public philosophy, which was optimistic, which is the Panglossian view, because it was orthodox, decidedly Christian, and held privately to a view which was much closer to Spinozism and which would have led him to perhaps lose his position in the employ of patrons. So basically the charge is there's a sort of intellectual cowardice in Leibniz. What we know from his published manuscripts is sort of trimming to the received notions of the time, whereas his private views were, of course, much more esoteric and much more unorthodox. Well, unfortunately, I think such a distinction, while it may have some validity, fails to help us understand the historical significance of Leibniz. The Leibniz that had a historical impact was the published Leibniz, was the Panglossian Leibniz. And I think there is a relation between the two, and I think that while there's some validity in what Russell says, he may take it a bit far. So before I present the views of Leibniz, however, and I'm going to cull them primarily from two sources, the Discourses on Metaphysics and the Monadology, I think it's important to suggest the problematic or basic assumptions that underlay Leibniz's work. Leibniz writing, like Spinoza's, follows on the heels of the Cartesian revolution of modern philosophy. And he's grappling with the elements of that problematic, of that series of questions and issues, that paradigm. So, what are some of the issues involved in the Cartesian problematic? Well, the first is actually a result not of Descartes, but an inheritance from the scholastic and Aristotelian past, and that is the logic of the syllogism. Syllogistic logic is essentially argues that all propositions can be reduced into a statement about a thing. It takes a form of subject-predicate proposition. Now, the implications for this metaphysically are that since all propositions state qualities or accidents or properties of some subject, that the obvious metaphysical analog of that is that what we're really talking about are substances and their accidents. And as we'll see, that has profound implications for Descartes, for Spinoza, and in our case, for Leibniz as well. It also raises a question of the distinction between the necessary proposition, which is that predicate whose notion is contained in the subject is analytic, and the contingent one, that predicate whose, or those accidents whose relation to the subject is something we only learn from experience. There's no essential relationship there. Okay, so that's one part of the Cartesian problematic. Another is, of course, mind-body dualism. Descartes had established, at least in to his own satisfaction, that one can distinguish two fundamental substances in the world. In fact, three, but the two ones I want to deal with first are mind and body. And the difference between them is the fundamental attribute or predicate of the substance of mind is thought. Right? The property that minds have is thought. They are, in fact, unextended. One can't think of half a mind or a quarter of a mind. One can't quantify a mind. One can't weigh a mind. One can't spatially locate a mind. It is a non-physical and unextended phenomena. And therefore, there's a strong contrast between that and body or matter, whose essence is extension. By extension, we mean the volume, the ability to take up space, to have position. Now, those are, of course, two of the three Cartesian substances. The third is God. So if we, using our substance-accident subject-predicate logic here, we would say that the substance of mind, the predicate of the substance of mind is thought. The predicate of the substance of body is extension. The predicate of the substance of God is perfection. That's its essence of that notion. This also raises questions, again, of necessary versus contingent, because Descartes argued, in fact, one of the ways he established a mind-body distinction was that the existence of the mind could not be doubted. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Right? It was, you could not doubt the existence of your mind. You could, however, doubt the existence of your body. That's a contingent truth. It is possible, he said, or conceivable at least, that you are, in fact, unextended and that your experiences of a body could be a dream or could be something, could be the result of an evil genie. Now, obviously, the assumption in believing that there are bodies is that our mind, or the ideas we have in our mind, are reflections of the external world of bodies in the form of the ideas, images, and representations that flash before our mind. Okay. I want to next mention the third element of the Cartesian problematic, the epistemology of clear and distinct ideas. This is a rationalist epistemology. Since all we have intimate acquaintance of, in fact, are our ideas, right? The images and representations in our mind. How can we tell which ones are true and which ones are false? And what the Cartesians offered, and Leibniz is one, is basically a sort of psychological doctrine. Those which we perceive with clarity and distinction, and I think the paradigm case of this are mathematical ideas, where we have a very precise, clear definition and sense of exactly what the nature of the idea is, are true, and those which are unclear and indistinct probably are not. This brings us to the problem of interaction. How is it that an extended substance, like my body, can somehow interact with an unextended substance like my mind? Consider, when physical substances interact, they do so through contiguity, right? They directly impact one another. Billiard balls strike one another and give each other force. How is it that something which only communicates through physical contact can influence something which is not capable of physical contact? What is the mechanism that brings together these two distinct kinds of substances? And of course, the answer is a quandary. There is no clear solution to it. Descartes thought somehow, in some kind of a way, the pituitary gland might be a bizarre medium between the two. That, of course, begged the question, how can a pituitary gland, which is extended, contain a soul which is unextended, since it can have no position? Well, Descartes' followers came up with a logical answer, which is parallelism. They don't, in fact, interact. You may seem to think that you decide to lift your arm and your arm rises, and that there's some causal relation there. But in fact, the rising of your arm simply parallels your decision. They're distinct. Their causal order is distinct. It is as if, think of mind and body as two universes, each perfectly tuned clocks. And God the clockmaker tunes them so well that they run in perfect synchronicity. So that just as in your mind you say, I want to lift my arm, so in your body the clock is run in such a way that your arm lifts. And it would seem as if they're interacting, but in fact they're just parallel and perfectly tuned. Finally, the last problem, the most damning for the Cartesian problematic, is skepticism. Since we only have access to our ideas, how can we ever know if those ideas are in fact accurate representations of the external world? We can't compare them to the external world because we can never have access to it. We can't get outside of our minds. How do we know, in fact, that there is an external world and that we're not just experiencing a huge dream? And that's one of the crises of the Cartesian problematic that can never really be very fruitfully resolved. Okay, given that, what Leibniz does is explore that disjuncture between an extended world of physical substances and a more true world of mind, thought, of different sorts of substances which don't have the qualities we've observed, and to argue that, in fact, that distinction is stronger than we might think, that our experience of extended physical world might, in fact, be illusory, might, in fact, be a feature of our of our imagination and of our perception of things rather than things in themselves. This is not an incredibly radical idea. Since Galileo, people had remarked that objects themselves probably don't really have color. Today we would agree with that. They have energy, and that energy interacts with our retinas in such a way as to produce the experience we call color. But in and of itself, it just has energy. Similarly with other so-called secondary qualities. What Leibniz does is take it a step farther. He says certain features that you thought were bedrock in the world, unlike color and other and other sensory phenomena, are in fact also illusory in the same way. And specifically he looks at space, time, and extension. All three give an example of the way he distinguishes between a real metaphysical realm and what Kant would call a phenomenal realm of appearances, the way things look to us. And they look that way because we add elements to them that they don't naturally have. He defines space as something merely relative. I hold it to be an order of coexistences as time is an order of successions. Okay, what does he mean? Again, this is very much like Kant. He argues that space is a three-dimensional mental construction of the arrangement of elements. We see distinct elements and from each of our points of view, we construct or place those elements in a three-dimensional grid. But the grid is not, in fact, there. It's something we add to organize our experience. What is there are simply the things themselves. In our case, we'll see that they are actually monads. For that reason, he concludes quite rightly that space is relative. There is no absolute position. Positions are all relative to the perception of the viewer. For that reason, in the case of the monadology, we'll see each monad has its own particular point of view or perspective. Space, therefore, is not something objective, but something that our mind contributes to our perception or experience to construct a physical world, which in and of itself is not necessarily physical in the sense in which we think of it. Similarly, time, right? If space is a three-dimensional grid we map on to events that or to phenomena that we see, time is a grid of before and afters that we map on to our perceptions, to our ideas, to our mental states, right? It makes no sense to speak of a time being out there aside from all of our perceptions. If there were no monads, if nothing existed, there would be no time. So time is something we've added to the universe in the sense of mentally constructed. It's not something that's in the universe in and of itself. He goes, however, one step even further and says the same can be said of extension. And the significance of this is, remember, extension is the essence of matter. So what he's offering is an extremely strong critique of materialism that is proto-Berkeleyan. He argues that extension is also a relative and reducible notion. Reducible, namely, to the contiguity of various parts at one place and time. what this means basically is that our notion of space, if we recur to it, right, a three-dimensional grid we've mapped on to things, to our experience of distinct substances and elements, our notion involves a notion of extension whereby when we have various things directly contiguous, sort of hanging together, being together, we posit that they take up a certain volume. And that's the way we construct those things. But that volume and that aggregation is something we add in and of itself. It's not extended. Now, this is a very bizarre notion, but monadology bears some surface resemblance to atomism. The analogy could be drawn in this way. We think of a substance like this podium as solid. But according to atomic theory, in fact, most of it is vacuous. When we get down to the atomic level, most of what comprises this podium is in fact space between particles. So there is in fact no extension here, or very little extension. Most of it is, the extension is a posit to make sense out of the aggregation of atoms within this podium. And the monad serves a very similar function, except that unlike the atom which is itself extended, the monad is not. That again seems a very strange notion, but consider if we get beyond the atomic theory of atoms and subatomic particles and get to the constituents of what makes up an electron. When we get to the level of energy, that too turns out to really be in some sense non-extended. So it's, again, a strange notion, but it's not entirely that far off from what certain physicists believe. In any case, what we see is that extension involves plurality and aggregation. Therefore, because it involves plurality, Leibniz can logically deduce that it can only apply to aggregates, by which he means that it's infinitely and infinitesimally divisible. Therefore, simple substances, which are not aggregates, cannot be extended, since extension only applies to aggregates. That is why he deduces that the monads must be unextended. And in fact, the best way to think of monads is as a sort of metaphysical point. They're a sort of posited position in the metaphysical universe. They are, in fact, simple substances, the most basic elements of which all of the universe is made. And again, the analogy with atomic theory here is good. In fact, it's probably better than atomic theory because we now know atoms are made of smaller parts. So we could think of these monads as sort of an analogy with energy fields or energy points or quarks or whatever, what have you. Where the analogy begins to break down is when he argues that monads have substantial forms or entelechies. That monads are in fact, or have in fact, souls. Well, first of all, why does he think such a curious doctrine? And then secondly, what can that possibly mean? Well, what he has in mind, the reason he thinks that is, consider, we've eliminated extension. What were the substances we had? We had God, matter, and mind. Right? We're leaving God aside for now. We've gotten rid of matter. There's no extension. What's left? Only mind, only soul. So it is a natural and logical inference to draw, therefore, that the monad must simply be, in a sense, a soul. Now, what does that practically mean? Well, it practically means that in some sense, within the monad, it has a guiding principle which determines its development. Right? It has an inclination or disposition. And we'll talk about that a bit more when we come to compound substances. But perhaps the best way of getting at it at this point is to note that monads have both perception and appetition. Now, what does he mean by perception? Obviously, he doesn't mean that all monads have sensory response. We wouldn't think that of the smallest elements of, say, a rock. But rather, that what lies behind our notion of perception as sensory response is the fact that when we perceive things, our senses or our mind reflects external phenomena that are going on around us. So to say that a monad has extension simply means that the monad's development or internal state reflects the universe in its own finite way. One can think of the monads of a rock reflecting the nature of the universe surrounding it by eroding when it's splashed with water. So perception is really just the internal state of a monad representing or mirroring things external to it. Now, the principle of change, what causes one perception to develop to another, one change in the state of a monad to another, is what he calls appetition. Appetition is probably the best word we could use besides final cause or entelechy might be inclination or disposition. That there is an internal logic within a substance which leads it to develop in a particular way. Now, obviously, there are degrees of perception. There are, for example, plants and minerals have a very unclear and indistinct perception. Right. Plants and animals, on the other hand, have a superior perception. They not only reflect what goes on around them in a more clear and distinct way, but they also have a memory in their perception of what has preceded. Right? If you take a dog and train it to, or constantly ring a bell before you feed it, eventually if you ring a bell, it will begin to salivate, as Pavlov showed. That's because it has memory. And finally, humans have something he calls apperception, which is not only memory, but also consciousness and the ability to reflect on our feelings and memories, a sort of self-consciousness. Okay, I'll explore that a bit more when we come to the discussion of the soul and the body in humans, but obviously we can surmise from what we've heard so far of these simple substances that compound substances are in fact simply aggregates of monads. Right? A body is simply a collection of monads, much as we would say a physical body is a collection of molecules, or of organs, or of tissues. And indeed, it may be an aggregate of an aggregate of an aggregate, so that we wind up with a, as he argues, once you begin dividing matter, you can do so infinitesimally. Again, your body is made up of various organs. Those organs are made out of cells. Those cells are made out of molecules. Those molecules are made out of atoms, etc., etc., etc. Okay, then how is it that when we find organic compounds, there seems to be a relationship between the monads of the body and the monads of that have the greatest apperception, the monad of the soul or mind? Well, he argues that in such cases, in animals and organic entities, there is a dominant monad. A monad whereby the action of the monads of the bodies seems to act as if it was doing so for the sake of the monad of the mind. In fact, it can't be so because, as we'll see, monads can't interact. But nonetheless, it is so arranged that they reflect the desires, wills, final causes of the dominant monad or soul. In the case of a human, that's the rational soul. Okay. So again, to run through our hierarchy of souls, and Leibniz insists that, in fact, there is a clear hierarchy of monads. And here, again, his reading of Suarez and scholastic philosophy shines through. He is in fact arguing for a reinstitution of Aristotle's view of a great chain of being. Plants have the least perceptive monads. Animals have, their dominant monads have both memory and feeling. And humans have memory, feeling, and self-consciousness. That self-consciousness, that ability to not only perceive something, but also state in addition, I am aware that I am perceiving such, or I am thinking of such, is self-consciousness. And it is precisely that which for him is the source of abstraction, metaphysics, and what we would call reflexivity. Where does our notion of substance come from? Leibniz says it comes from our self-consciousness, our awareness of ourself as a substance, and then metaphysically imposed on the universe as such. All right. That roughly is the bare bones of the doctrine of monads. The question is, if each of these monads is a distinct substance, and each of them is in some sense unique, for if they didn't, in some sense, if they weren't completely unique, they would be identical. Right? Two things that have the same properties are not in fact two different things, they're the same thing. right? Since what defines identity is sharing all of the same properties. If that's the case, then how do monads interact? The old Cartesian problem, how do substances interact? And in fact, Leibniz argued quite logically, they can't, and they don't. Okay. Well, then how do we explain the fact that they seem to interact? Again, the solution, the obvious one, is parallelism. But note the difference. Leibniz has argued not for two substances, but for an infinite, or rather better yet, an innumerable quantity of substances, each one being a monad. Therefore, his parallelism is not two clocks perfectly timed, but an innumerable number of clocks perfectly timed to each other and every other clock, each one unfolding in exact correspondence with every other one throughout the universe, which, since there is no space, is completely full. Right? If there is no objective space, we must have, in fact, the maximum possible number of beings that are imaginable. Okay, well, that's certainly a fabulous doctrine. Right? Everything in the universe is unfolding in exact correlation with everything else, but never interacts with it. What this allows him to do is identify or reconcile the efficient causality we find in science and in mechanism with the final causality we find in moral thought and particularly in theology. Efficient causality rules in nature, in the world of phenomena, in the world of aggregates based on space-time and extension which we add to them. In the world in and of itself, the world of monads, the causal order is final, or is based on entelechy, a end state which naturally evolves. And again, the classic cases of this are plants, right? The little acorn becomes the oak tree. Somewhere in the acorn is a potential, given certain circumstances, it will naturally evolve into an oak tree. And he argues that everything in nature follows that pattern. Everything, excuse me, in the universe metaphysically follows that pattern, just as everything in the physical world of nature follows the pattern of efficient causality. They perfectly mirror each other, but never interact again. Okay. Finally, because each of these clocks is perfectly timed to every other clock, each monad is, on the one hand, autonomous. It never, in fact, interacts with any other monad, therefore it completely is self-determined, but is also a microcosm of the entire universe. If you could look at a particular monad in a rock, you could see the state of all other monads everywhere else in the universe, past, present, and future. Now again, this is a very fabulous doctrine. Strangely enough, perhaps not so strangely enough, he thinks there's also evidence for this not only in the metaphysical realm, but in the physical realm. If he's going to argue for a mechanistic view of nature as determined, that must mean that every physical event that happens has consequences, determines physical events that surround it, which surround others, which surround others. So every physical event must impact every other physical state everywhere, across time. He is in fact arguing for what we now call the butterfly effect. If you've never heard of this in meteorology, if a butterfly flaps its wings in a certain way in Brazil, it should affect the weather in New York 6 months later. Simply because everything, because it unleashes a chain of causes which impacts every other thing. So in that sense, in both realms, the metaphysical realm and the physical realm, every monad is in fact a mirror of everything that has ever happened, ever will happen to every other monad. This view, of course, is a result of determinism, of the belief that everything is, in fact, caused in some sense. In the physical world, I've suggested it's the butterfly effect. In the metaphysical realm, the realm of final causes, instead of thinking of it as comprising the interaction of all different substances or physical phenomena, think of it rather as reflecting the complete history of our apperceptions, inclinations, appetitions across time. So if I could understand the state of Julius Caesar just before crossing the Rubicon, if I could truly understand it, I would understand how everything that has happened in the wills and entelechy of everything before him led to that moment. And if I could see the causal laws that produced that, I could also deduce that several thousand years later, I would be standing here sitting and walking back and forth and uttering the sentences I'm uttering right now. Okay. In fact, we can't make such a calculation. That's no reason to assume that such a calculation can't be made. It just can't be made by us. It can be made by God. And for that reason, God plays a very important role in Leibniz's speculations. Obviously, God is the most perfect monad, the monad which pre-timed all these clocks and preset them. And Leibniz argues quite strongly for the existence of God with 4 distinct arguments, many of which you have previously heard in scholastic thought. He offers an ontological argument, often known as St. Anselm's proof. The argument runs something like this. First, he tries to establish that it is possible to imagine God, the perfect being. Right? Not all so-called perfections are possible. We cannot, in fact, imagine the infinite number. We cannot, in fact, imagine the smallest chunk of matter, because matter is infinitely divisible. We can, however, think of a moral excellency without limit. We can, however, think of a metaphysical being without limit. Therefore, it's possible to think of God as defined as the most perfect being. If that's the case, isn't it true, he would argue, that a being that is most perfect would have to exist for this reason? If you had a choice between a perfect being that did exist and a perfect being that didn't exist, wouldn't it be the case that the one that did exist, since it had the property of existence, was more perfect than the other? But since God is the most perfect being, therefore, he exists. All right. The second argument is the argument from eternal truths. Eternal truths are, as we mentioned, necessary ideas. For example, 2 + 2 = 4. It's an eternal truth, a necessary truth, not contingent on our experience. Such truths are true at all times and forever. It was true tomorrow that 2 + 2 = 4. It was true yesterday. It always will be. It's a true idea, eternally true. But ideas exist only in minds, right? They don't float around shopping malls. They don't, loiter in your shoes. They exist in your mind. Therefore, there must be an eternal idea, an eternal mind, to hold eternal ideas. Elsewise, they would cease to be eternal and cease to exist when not in the mind of some finite being. And a eternal being whose understanding includes the eternal ideas is precisely what we call God. Okay. Now, there's the cosmological argument. Again, this involves an infinite regress of causes. We note everything that occurs has a cause. And everything that, if A causes B, A in turn is caused by something else. The problem is you cannot go back infinitely with this regression. There must be a first cause, which must in turn not be caused to get the whole series started. Otherwise, the analysis never ends. And that's an uncaused cause. And of course, that's what we mean by God. Finally, there is the argument from the pre-established harmony. That pre-established harmony, as you remember, is the rule that everything that evolves, all the monads, their parallelism is, as they develop in exact harmony with the development of every other monad. All the clocks are perfectly set, that infinite number of clocks. And this is a form, obviously, of argument from design. The very fact that there's such an intricate mechanism that every monad is developing in such a way to mirror every other monad everywhere suggests that there must have been some intelligence behind it which designed it in such an absolutely perfect way. Okay. One of Leibniz's other principles was something he called the law of sufficient reason. And again, this has to do with his determinism and rationalism. The law states simply that everything that occurs, and for every state, there must be a sufficient reason why it occurred and not something else. For every bounce of a billiard ball, there must be some mechanical explanation why it bounced in such a way, with such a force, rather than some other way. Right? If that's the case, then that sufficient reason suggests that everything that has happened, will happen, and does happen, has a reason and is necessary. That raises a real problem for Leibniz. If that's the case, how can he be orthodox in arguing that there is such a thing as free will? Right? Sufficient reason leads directly to determinism. Everything that has happened, will happen, has to happen exactly as it does. And he draws a distinction between what he calls metaphysical necessity, which we would call determinism, and a moral necessity. If we conceive of the action of certain dominant monads, mainly those which are rational spirits, which are at the top of the chain of being, as inhabiting not only a metaphysical world, but a world of wills, a world of decisions and choices, it is completely consistent with our being metaphysically determined to some particular action for us to be free in the sense that we could have willed other, but we don't. Because, in fact, we choose, but our choice is determined, according to Leibniz, by the perceived good. And this is part of Leibniz's inspiring optimism. And it's, again, very reminiscent of Plato, Plato's ethical rationalism. Everybody that acts for what they think is the good. When evil occurs, it's because they don't recognize the good clearly and distinctly. Well, if that's true, then we can see that the reason we err is because we don't have a clear and distinct understanding of the nature of things. We incline towards the good, but we don't always know what it is. But God, who is perfect, always knows what it is. Therefore, God always wills the best. Which brings us to the question of the law of sufficient reason and the world. If everything that exists must have a sufficient reason, and the world exists, what is the sufficient reason for the existence of this world? Right? Leibniz acknowledges there are an infinity of possible worlds God could have created. Yet he chose to create this particular one. Why? What's the sufficient reason? Well, again, the key there is that God has the most clear and distinct perceptions. Like a rational soul, he's determined by, or chooses what is the good. Therefore, he has chose this world because it maximizes the good. It maximizes perfection. Therefore, we can conclude, quite logically, that this is, in fact, the best of all possible worlds. And that's, of course, the principle of perfection. God could have willed any number of worlds, but he created one where the maximum number of compossibilities, which is to say the maximum number of possibilities that don't contradict each other, which can stand together, and which maximizes the good and perfection, can exist. God acts for the best, in other words. And again, this is the best of all possible worlds. Now, there seems to be evil in the world, and that would seem to contradict Leibniz's view. Leibniz argues that, in fact, apparent evil is not a real thing to begin with. Here he takes a very pious Augustinian stance. It's simply willing something other than what is truly good, i.e., in this case, God. A better way of thinking about this practically is to say, look, the evil exists because men choose evil. They choose to do what is not the best. But they couldn't choose to do not the best unless they had free will. And free will is undeniably a good. So God, in giving us a free will, could not have created us without allowing us to sin. Therefore, the fact that we do sinful things does not contradict the fact that this is still the best of all possible worlds. For if he had created us without the possibility of sinning, he couldn't have given us a free will, which is better, on balance, to have free will and occasionally sin than to not have free will and be perfectly virtuous automatons without truly rational souls. Therefore, in that example, we can see how God maximizes the amount of good in the universe, even by using evil and sin. One can always take the example of thirst and satiety with drink. Right, that although we experience thirst as a discomfort, the amount of pleasure we get when we subsequently drink overbalances the amount of pain we experienced when we were thirsty. Okay, I want to briefly conclude this presentation with a couple comments about Leibniz. First, some of the problems involved with Leibniz, and with all Cartesians, notably the problem of interaction of monads. Since monads don't interact, right? And we know, in fact, that each, presumably, corresponds to the development of every other one through some internal mechanism, which is the principle of pre-established harmony. How do we, in fact, know that they that their development corresponds to each other. I mean, take the dominant monad of your soul or of your mind. It has images of the development of others external to it, which are not causally determined, but simply a result of the unfolding of your clock in exact correspondence with the other clock. But since you never get in touch with the other clock, how do you know that there is an exact correspondence? How do you, in fact, know that there are any other monads? Leibniz can't answer that question. And in fact, this is basic Cartesian skepticism. How can we, if all we have access to is our perceptions or our ideas, how can we know that there's anything to correspond to them, that the universe is anything but a show between your ears? There's, however, a bigger issue involved in Leibniz. These are fabulous doctrines. They're mystical, they're inspiring, they're orthodox, they're extremely logical. They're, in fact, logical results of Cartesianism, and yet they are at a certain level outrageous, ridiculous. The universe is made up of an infinite number of substances who don't interact and unfold in perfect harmony with every other? That everything mirrors everything else kind of in a different way, and everything is everywhere where it can be, and there's no empty spaces, and it's the best of all possible worlds? Philosophers may take that seriously. Men in the street would, you know, if you proposed it to them, would ask about your medication. The reason I raise this point is, when you have a completely logical deduction from the Cartesian problematic, and it generates this sort of metaphysical flight of fancy, you're very close to reductio ad absurdum of Cartesianism. You're beginning to say, look, this paradigm, when treated logically, generates outrageously bizarre results. Therefore, this whole paradigm has to be questioned. And that may be the most important historical significance of Leibniz. He's the end point of rationalism. He suggests there has to be a new paradigm. And that new paradigm is exactly what follows him, the paradigm of British empiricism. Thank you very much.